Hello everyone, welcome to Sleep Space. Tonight we will talk about a fascinating and unusual question. Can you meet your past self? Imagine for a moment that memory isn't just something stored inside your brain like files in a cabinet, but rather a living bridge stretching across time. If that bridge could be crossed, if you could stand face to face with the person you once were, what would that reunion reveal? Would you recognize yourself? Would you be proud, embarrassed, or maybe even startled at how different you've become? This idea isn't just playful science fiction, it touches on some of the deepest questions about memory, identity, and what makes us who we are. Tonight, we're going to take a journey into that question, weaving together psychology, neuroscience, philosophy, and imagination to see what it would mean if you could shake hands with your own past. Let's begin with memory itself. Scientists often describe memory as a reconstruction rather than a recording. When you recall your first day of school or your first heartbreak, you don't pull out a perfect video file from the past. Instead, your brain rebuilds that event from scattered fragments, visual images, emotional impressions, even the stories you've told yourself later. That means the past self you remember is already filtered, edited, and shaped by who you are now. If memory is the bridge, it's not a perfectly paved one. It's more like an old stone path that has been weathered, patched, and sometimes misremembered. Now picture what it would be like if those memories weren't just reconstructions in your head, but actual portals to the past. What if you could cross over that bridge and stand in the room with the younger version of you, the one who didn't know what you know now, who carried different fears, different hopes, and maybe even a completely different worldview? How would that conversation go? The first layer to explore is identity. Are you still the same person as your past self? In philosophy, this is known as the problem of personal identity. Some thinkers argue that identity is like a river. It keeps flowing and changing, but we still call it the same river. Others argue that identity is tied to continuity of memory, meaning that as long as you can remember being that person, you are still them. But here's the twist. Memory is unreliable. You forget more than you remember. You reinterpret old memories as you grow. So are you truly continuous with your past self? Or are you closer to a series of connected but distinct individuals, each one shaped by the passage of time? If you could meet your past self, you might feel the way you do when you find an old photograph. At first, you recognize the face. It's you, of course. But then you see the way that version of you is looking at the world, and suddenly they feel like a stranger. Imagine trying to explain to your 10-year-old self the complexity of adult life. Imagine trying to explain heartbreak, loss, or responsibility to them. Imagine explaining the internet, or your current job, or even your current favorite food if it's something they once hated. Would they believe you? Or would they laugh and shake their head, insisting they would never turn into someone like you? Memory scientists point out something fascinating here. When you imagine your future self, your brain often treats that person almost like another person entirely. In brain scans, thinking about yourself in the future lights up patterns similar to when you think about a stranger. So perhaps meeting your past self would feel eerily similar, like encountering someone you know very well, yet not entirely. Let's take this thought experiment further. If memory is the bridge, then perhaps every time you recall a moment from the past, you are already brushing shoulders with that earlier version of yourself. The act of remembering is, in a way, a reunion. You bring them back into existence, even briefly, and they live again through you. The question becomes, is the version you summon in your mind accurate, or is it an echo you've reshaped so many times it no longer matches the original? This brings us to neuroscience. Memories are stored in networks of neurons, particularly involving the hippocampus and related structures. Each time you recall something, those neurons fire and the memory becomes malleable. That means every act of remembering is also an act of rewriting. When you recall your first day of school, you may not be remembering the actual day as much as the last time you remembered it. Slowly, the memory drifts, like a story retold until the details shift. If you met your past self, perhaps they would argue with you about what really happened. Maybe your younger self would insist that the shirt you wore was blue, not green, or that the feeling you remember wasn't quite the same. In that sense, meeting your past self would be a confrontation between two versions of reality. There's also the emotional aspect. Meeting your past self might feel like opening an old diary. Some entries would make you smile with nostalgia. Others might make you cringe. Would you forgive your younger self for the mistakes they made, knowing they didn't yet have the wisdom you do now? Or would you judge them, forgetting that you only learned through the very stumbles they took? And just as importantly, would they forgive you? If your younger self had dreams you didn't fulfill, or values you no longer hold, they might look at you with disappointment. Perhaps the harshest critic you could ever face would be the earlier version of yourself, the one who thought anything was possible. And then there's the playful side of the question. If you could really meet your past self, would it create a paradox? If you told your younger self about what's coming, would that change the future? Would you suddenly unravel the bridge of memory itself, rewriting who you are in this very moment? Science fiction has loved this idea for decades. The ripple effect, the butterfly effect, the notion that one small interaction could alter everything. But in this more personal sense, the paradox is emotional rather than physical. Every time you think back, you're already changing the way your past fits into your life story. So maybe the reunion with your past self wouldn't happen in a literal room. Maybe it happens every time you reflect on who you once were. The bridge of memory lets you meet them, question them, and sometimes even comfort them. You might picture your younger self sitting across from you, and in that imagined dialogue, you discover something real about yourself today. Tonight, as we wander into this question, let's treat it not as a puzzle to solve, but as a window to explore. The thought experiment isn't about whether it could actually happen in some science fiction sense. It's about what it reveals about us. What does it mean to carry your past within you? What does it mean to realize you are both the same person and a completely different one from who you were years ago? The reunion, whether imagined or real, is an encounter with the mystery of identity. And that's the path we'll continue exploring. What exactly is the self that we are trying to meet? We often assume there's a stable you running through time, like a thread woven through every year of your life. But the closer scientists and philosophers look, the more slippery this idea becomes. Perhaps when you imagine meeting your past self, you're not really visiting someone who still exists, but confronting a phantom, a collection of traces that live only in your brain and body, yet the thought of them feels real, almost as if they're waiting for you across the years. Think about the ship of Theseus, a classic puzzle from ancient philosophy. The story goes like this. A ship is preserved in a harbour, but over time, every plank, every nail, every piece of wood is replaced. At the end of the process, none of the original material remains. Is it still the same ship? Now apply this to yourself. Every 7 to 10 years, most of the cells in your body are replaced. Your memories fade and shift. Your beliefs evolve. Is the child version of you truly the same person who sits here today? If you met them, would it be like encountering another individual entirely? Someone who just happens to carry your name and your DNA? Psychologists studying childhood amnesia remind us that we can't even remember much from our earliest years. For most people, Memories before the age of 3 or 4 are completely inaccessible. So, if you met your toddler self, you wouldn't even have the bridge of memory to connect you. They wouldn't recognize you, and you wouldn't recognize them. The strangeness of that thought shows us how much of meeting the past self depends not on literal time travel, but on memory's fragile thread. Still, memory is powerful. Even though it's imperfect, it creates the illusion of continuity. When you look back at your teenage years, you may cringe at your choices, but you also recognize the seeds of who you are now. Your sense of humor, your curiosity, your patterns of thought, they were all forming then. Meeting that version of yourself might feel like meeting a distant relative, familiar yet foreign. Here's another layer to consider. The self is not just biological or psychological, but narrative. You tell yourself stories about who you are and who you've been. I've always loved music. I was shy as a kid, but grew out of it. I made mistakes, but I learned. These are narrative threads, weaving together snapshots of memory into a coherent story. If you met your past self, you might discover that their version of the story doesn't match yours. They might insist, "No, I don't love music, I hate it," or "I'm not shy, I'm just careful." The encounter would be like two authors arguing over the true version of a shared book. Neuroscientist Antonio Damasio once wrote that the self is not a thing, but a process, a dynamic pattern constantly unfolding. If that's true, then meeting your past self would be like meeting an earlier stage of an ongoing dance. You'd see the same rhythm, but expressed differently. And in that encounter, you might realize something profound. The self you are now is just as temporary as the self you once were. One day, your current version will be the past self that a future you looks back on with curiosity, judgment, or affection. Let's stretch the thought experiment even further. Suppose you could have a conversation with your past self, not just observe them. What advice would you give? The temptation, of course, would be to warn them about mistakes or guide them toward better choices. But imagine how overwhelming that would be for your younger self. They wouldn't have your perspective, your maturity, or your emotional resilience. The wisdom you carry now is built on all the experiences you've had, including the mistakes. Without those stumbles, you wouldn't be the person you are. So in a way, giving advice to your past self might undo the very lessons that make you who you are. Instead, maybe the best gift wouldn't be advice, but compassion. Meeting your past self could be an opportunity to reassure them, to tell them they were doing the best they could with what they knew, to let them know they weren't alone, even in their hardest moments, because you, their future self, survived. This version of the reunion transforms the thought experiment into something healing. It's less about paradoxes and more about forgiveness. Psychologists have studied a practice called self-distancing, where you reflect on your past from a more detached perspective, almost like watching yourself in a movie. This can help people cope with regret, trauma, or embarrassment. Meeting your past self could be the ultimate form of self-distancing. Instead of carrying the weight of your old mistakes, you could see them embodied in that earlier version of you and realize that you've grown beyond them. That realization might bring a sense of release. But let's not forget the opposite side of the coin. Meeting your past self could also be humbling. They might ask you questions you can't answer. Why did you stop chasing that dream? Why did you hurt that person? Why did you give up on something we cared about? Their innocence might shine a light on the compromises you've made, the values you've let slip. That conversation could be uncomfortable, like holding up a mirror to your choices. Yet even that discomfort might be valuable. It could remind you of the ideals you once had, sparking a renewal in the present. Now imagine a different twist. What if meeting your past self wasn't limited to one age? What if you could gather all your past selves in a room together? Your childhood self, your teenage self, your young adult self, and every stage in between. The room would be full of voices, each one representing a chapter of your life. Some might argue, others might laugh, some might cry. And you, the current self, would be at the centre, trying to make sense of it all. This gathering would reveal just how many different people you've been, and yet somehow they're all you. This idea has a scientific parallel in the way the brain stores autobiographical memory. Different parts of your brain light up for different types of memory: emotional memories, factual memories, sensory impressions. Bringing them together into a coherent sense of self is something your brain does seamlessly, but it's actually a complex orchestration. The reunion of selves is happening neurologically all the time. Thinking of it as a literal gathering of your past versions just makes that orchestration visible. Another perspective comes from Buddhism, which often teaches that the self is an illusion. From this view, meeting your past self would show you that there is no permanent you at all. What you'd see is a temporary bundle of habits, perceptions, and conditions that have long since dissolved. The past self doesn't exist anywhere except in memory, and memory itself is fleeting. This isn't meant to be depressing, it's liberating. It suggests that you're not chained to who you once were. Each moment is a chance to be new. Yet at the same time, our culture loves the idea of continuity. We keep childhood toys, yearbooks, photos, and journals because they anchor us to the story of who we've been. Meeting your past self fits into that same longing. The wish to look across the bridge of memory and see that it's really connected, that you really have been on a journey rather than just drifting moment to moment. Whether or not the self is an illusion, the experience of continuity matters. It shapes how we make sense of our lives. Here's a final image for this part of our exploration. Imagine sitting on a bench in a quiet park. A child walks up and sits beside you. You realise it's you, years younger, full of questions and wonder. They look at you curiously, maybe even with awe. You don't need to say much. Just being there is enough. In that silent companionship, you recognise the bridge of memory not as something broken or perfect, but as something alive. A living thread connecting every version of you, carrying both the weight and the beauty of time. When we talk about meeting a past version of ourselves, there's an unspoken assumption behind the idea that time is laid out like a map, with each moment existing somewhere, waiting for us to return. But is that true? What is the nature of time itself? If memory is a bridge, then the bridge must connect to something real. But does the past exist in the same way the present does? Or is it just a ghost, accessible only through the imagination? Physics gives us some curious possibilities. Einstein's theory of relativity suggests that time is not a flowing river, but part of a four-dimensional fabric called space-time. In this view, past, present, and future are all equally real, like different locations on a map. You don't destroy yesterday by stepping into today any more than you erase New York by travelling to Paris. If this block universe view is correct, then your past self still exists, frozen in their moment, forever living out their day in that slice of space-time. Meeting them might not be as impossible as it first seems. It might simply require the right kind of bridge. Now, of course, this is where science bumps into mystery. We don't have a way to walk across space-time, to step into our own past like we step across a room. But memory might be our built-in version of time travel. When you recall an event vividly, when you smell something that instantly brings you back to childhood, or hear a song that carries you to a moment long gone, it feels like you've travelled. The neuroscience of memory shows that recalling an event reactivates many of the same brain regions that lit up when the event first happened. In a sense, your brain simulates the past, allowing you to revisit it. Meeting your past self may already be happening in these mental simulations. But there's another twist. Neuroscientists studying the brain's default mode network, the system active when your mind wanders, have found that imagining the future and recalling the past use overlapping regions. When you picture your future self, your brain is repurposing the same machinery it uses to remember your past self. That means the act of projecting forward and the act of looking back are almost the same process. If memory is a bridge, it stretches not just backward, but forward as well. Meeting your past self and meeting your future self may be two sides of the same coin. This leads to a provocative question. If your brain can simulate the past, could it also simulate an encounter with your past self so vividly that it feels real? Some psychologists argue that the self is already a simulation, a constantly updated model the brain creates to keep track of experiences. When you imagine talking to your past self, your brain is simply creating another version of that simulation, a character who embodies your younger traits, beliefs, and feelings. The conversation may not be literal, but it's still psychologically powerful. In fact, therapy sometimes uses exercises like this. A person struggling with regret or shame might be asked to write a letter to their younger self, or even role-play a conversation with them. People often find this moving, sometimes even transformative. They realize they've been judging their younger self too harshly, or they discover compassion for that version of themselves. The imagined reunion becomes a tool for healing. But what if we take it beyond psychology? Some interpretations of quantum mechanics suggest that reality branches into parallel timelines with every choice, every possibility. If that's true, then perhaps your past self still exists in another branch. Not frozen, but continuing along their own path. Meeting them might mean encountering not just who you were, but who you could have been if you'd made different choices. That thought can be unsettling. Imagine standing face to face with a version of yourself who stayed in a relationship you left, who pursued a career you abandoned, or who lived in a city you never moved to. Would you envy them? Would you pity them? Or would you realize that each branch carries its own joys and sorrows, none better or worse, just different? Even without parallel universes, you can feel this branching when you reflect on what-if moments in your life. The decision you made, the chance you took, the path you walked, they all defined the person you became. Meeting your past self could bring those choices into sharp relief. You might see, more clearly than ever, how one small moment shaped everything that followed. That realization could either bring gratitude or regret, depending on how you view the path. There's also the question of recognition. If you stood before your past self, would they even believe you were them? Think of how skeptical you'd be if someone walked up claiming to be your future self. They'd have to prove it. They might reference private details, hidden fears, or childhood memories no one else could know. But even then, part of you might resist. The gap between who you were and who you are now might feel too wide. Meeting your past self could be less like a reunion and more like a negotiation, each of you struggling to prove your identity to the other. And then there's the emotional flood such an encounter might unleash. Imagine standing before your younger self and realizing how fragile they were, how little they knew of what was coming. Would you want to protect them? Or would you be overwhelmed by the weight of knowing everything they would endure? Meeting your past self could make you feel like both parent and child at once, guiding them, but also remembering what it felt like to be them. Interestingly, cultures around the world have rituals that echo this idea. Some rites of passage involve reflecting on childhood before stepping into adulthood. Some spiritual traditions encourage people to visualize themselves as children and offer them love. These practices suggest that meeting your past self is not just a quirky thought experiment, but a deeply human impulse. We long to make peace with who we've been. We long to feel whole, to see that the fragments of our lives are connected by a bridge that still stands. Science might argue that the past is gone, that you can't truly meet the person you once were. But imagination doesn't obey those limits. Imagination is where we build the bridges science can't. And in those imagined encounters, something real can happen. Emotions shift, understanding deepens, healing begins. Perhaps meeting your past self isn't about bending the laws of physics, but about using the power of memory and imagination to reconnect with forgotten parts of yourself. If meeting your past self is possible, then the encounter wouldn't just be about nostalgia or curiosity. It would be like holding up a mirror, one that doesn't reflect your present face but your former one. And what mirrors always do, whether you like it or not, is reveal. They reveal details you've forgotten, truths you've ignored, and sometimes flaws you'd rather not see. So what exactly would you see if your past self stood before you? The first thing might be vulnerability. Your past self would likely carry insecurities you've since buried or outgrown. Imagine your teenage self, worried about fitting in, desperate to be accepted, uncertain of who they were. You might smile at their worries, knowing they eventually faded, but in their eyes, those fears were everything. Meeting them would remind you of how heavy those small moments once felt, how fragile identity can be at its early stages. That recognition might deepen your empathy, not just for your past self, but for others around you now who are still carrying those same doubts. The second thing the mirror would show is your resilience. Think of the times you struggled, the moments when you thought you couldn't go on. Meeting your past self at one of those low points would let you say, "Look, we made it." You'd be proof of survival, standing there as living evidence that they endured. The reunion would remind you of strength you may have forgotten, the kind of strength that only becomes visible in hindsight. Sometimes the only way to recognize your resilience is to see it from the outside, as your past self would. But the mirror doesn't only show the good, it might also reveal regrets. If your past self had dreams you didn't pursue, meeting them might sting. You might hear them say, "What happened to us? Didn't we want to travel the world? Didn't we promise we'd always paint, or write, or sing?" Confronted with that voice, you might feel a pang of loss. And yet, regret itself can be illuminating. It shows you the gap between who you once hoped to be and who you are now. That gap doesn't always mean failure. Sometimes it reveals the unexpected paths that life took you down, paths you couldn't have imagined when you were younger. The reunion could also be surprising in ways you don't expect. Perhaps your past self wouldn't criticize you at all. Perhaps they'd be amazed at how far you've come. To a younger version of you, the life you live now might look extraordinary. The job you consider ordinary might be beyond their wildest dreams. The friendships you've built, the wisdom you've gathered, the challenges you've survived, these might seem heroic to them. Sometimes we forget how far we've traveled because we're so focused on the road ahead. Meeting your past self could shift your perspective, showing you that progress is often invisible until you measure it against where you started. And then there's the question of recognition. Would you recognize yourself in them? Would you look at their mannerisms, their smile, their nervous habits, and feel a flicker of familiarity? Or would you feel estranged, as though you were meeting a cousin rather than yourself? Psychologists studying temporal self-appraisal have found that people often see their past selves as inferior, less wise, less mature, less capable. This helps us feel like we've grown. But the downside is that we sometimes dismiss our past selves too quickly, forgetting the qualities they had that we've since lost. Meeting them face to face might remind you of the purity of wonder, the openness to possibility, or the fearless imagination that adulthood can dim. Imagine for a moment sitting across from your childhood self, their eyes wide, full of curiosity. What would they ask you? Maybe something simple. Do we still draw pictures? Do we still climb trees? Do we still laugh the same way? And in answering, you might realize that some parts of you have faded, not because they had to, but because life crowded them out. The mirror of the past self doesn't only show what you've gained, it also shows what you've left behind. That recognition can be bittersweet, but it can also be an invitation to reclaim the parts of you worth keeping. Now flip the mirror around. Think about what your past self would see in you. To them, you are the future, the unknown made flesh. They might be astonished by the technology you carry, by the relationships you've formed, by the way your body and voice have changed. They might also be puzzled by your choices, unable to understand why you did certain things. But in their gaze, you might notice something profound, the thread of continuity. They'd look at you and see traces of themselves, proof that they did, in fact, grow into someone. Even if you're not the person they imagined, you're still part of the story they began. That recognition can be grounding. It tells you that your life, however unexpected, is still connected to the child, the teenager, the young adult who once dreamed it into being. There's also a therapeutic quality to this imagined meeting. Psychologists sometimes encourage people to engage in inner child work, where they visualize speaking to their younger self with kindness. The goal is to heal wounds from the past, to give the compassion that might have been missing at the time. Meeting your past self in this way is less about paradoxes and more about wholeness. It allows you to acknowledge pain without being consumed by it, to offer understanding instead of judgment. But what about the harder questions? Suppose your past self asks, "Are we happy?" How would you answer? It's not an easy question because happiness shifts with time. What made your past self happy might not matter to you now. Meeting them could reveal just how much your definition of happiness has changed. As a child, maybe happiness meant play. As a teenager, maybe it meant freedom. As an adult, maybe it means stability or purpose. The reunion would highlight that happiness is not a single destination, but a moving target, always redefined by the version of yourself chasing it. Another revealing question might be, are we still us? Beneath the details of jobs, hobbies, and relationships, your past self might wonder if the essence of who they were still lives in you. And your answer would depend on what you believe about identity. If you see identity as continuous, you'd say yes, you are still the same person, just grown. If you see identity as ever-changing, you might say no. You're not the same, but that's okay. Either way, the question itself would shine light on your relationship with change. Do you embrace it as growth, or do you mourn it as loss? One of the deepest revelations in such a meeting might be that you are both the student and the teacher. Your past self could remind you of forgotten values, and you could offer them the wisdom of experience. The conversation would be a circle, not a straight line, each version of you learning from the other. That circularity reflects a truth about memory itself. It's not just a record of the past, but an active part of the present, shaping how you think, feel, and act. Every memory you carry is like a past self whispering in your ear, guiding your steps in ways you often don't notice. And perhaps the ultimate revelation is this: meeting your past self would show you that identity is not fixed, but layered. You are not only the person you were at 10, or 15, or 20, you are all of them at once. Like rings in a tree, each version still exists within you, hidden beneath the surface, but part of the structure. You don't outgrow your past selves, you carry them. Sometimes they weigh you down, sometimes they lift you up, but always they remain, woven into the person you are now. The mirror then is not meant to shame or flatter, it's meant to remind you of wholeness. It shows you that growth is real, but also that nothing is ever entirely lost. The past self and the present self are not strangers, they are reflections, each incomplete without the other. Mirrors don't just show us who we are, they often influence what we do next. Think about how looking in a mirror before leaving the house can make you fix your hair, straighten your clothes, or stand a little taller. In the same way, encountering your past self, whether literally imagined or metaphorically through memory, might not just reveal who you've been, but also shape who you're becoming. This brings us to the role of choice. Every decision you've ever made has carried you from one version of yourself to another. Some choices felt small at the time: what class to take, who to sit beside, which job to apply for. But they rippled outward in ways you couldn't predict. Others felt monumental, but their true impact only became clear years later. If you stood face to face with your past self, those choices would hang in the air between you. They'd want to know, why did you choose this path? Why not the other one? Would you answer with certainty, or would you admit that half the time you didn't know what you were doing, that you were stumbling forward and hoping for the best? In many ways, this is the human condition. We construct narratives about our past decisions, weaving them into coherent stories. But in truth, much of life is improvised. Meeting your past self might expose that improvisation, showing them that the future isn't a neat plan unfolding, but a messy, unpredictable dance. To them, that might feel frightening, but to you, it might feel freeing. Proof that even though you never had control over every outcome, you still arrived here, still standing, still carrying on. But here's the paradox. If you could tell your past self about the choices you made, might that knowledge alter who you are now? Imagine telling them about a heartbreak that shaped you. They might try to avoid it. But without that heartbreak, would you still learn resilience? Imagine telling them about a mistake that taught you humility. They might steer clear of it. But without that mistake, would you still have the compassion you now carry? Meeting your past self could tempt you to smooth out the rough edges of your life. Yet it's often those very rough edges that gave you depth. This is where the encounter becomes less about advice and more about dialogue. A true meeting wouldn't be one-sided, where you lecture your past self on what's ahead. It would be a conversation, a back and forth across time. They would challenge you with their innocence, and you would challenge them with your experience. That dialogue could reshape not only how you view the past, but how you act in the present. Think about how often we treat the past as fixed, like a book already written. But memory is not a library of untouched pages. It's more like a manuscript you keep revising. Every time you recall something, you slightly rewrite it, reshaping its meaning. This is why people sometimes reinterpret their childhoods later in life. What once felt like neglect might later be seen as independence, or what once felt like failure might be reframed as the foundation of strength. Meeting your past self could accelerate this reinterpretation, making the editing process visible. For example, suppose you've carried shame over a decision you made years ago. If your past self sat before you, you might finally see the context of their choice, their limited knowledge, their youthful impulses, their hunger for acceptance. In that light, you might forgive them, which means you'd also forgive yourself. The past doesn't change, but your relationship to it does. And that change ripples forward into the choices you make now, because how you see the past often determines how you see your possibilities in the present. On the other hand, meeting your past self might reignite forgotten dreams. Maybe they remind you of something you once longed for but abandoned. A career path, an art form, a passion for discovery. In their voice, you might hear the echo of your own deeper desires, ones that never truly disappeared, but were buried under responsibility or routine. That encounter could nudge you to pick up an old hobby, to pursue a new direction, or simply to bring more play back into your life. The past doesn't just weigh you down, it can call you forward. Another fascinating angle is how this dialogue might sharpen your sense of accountability. When we think of accountability, we often imagine being judged by others. But what if the truest accountability comes from facing yourself across time? What if the person you most want to answer to is not your boss, your partner, or even society, but the child who once dreamed inside you? Meeting your past self would make that accountability tangible. They'd look at you with innocent eyes and ask, "Did we stay true?" And while you might not always have a perfect answer, the very act of asking could realign your compass. It's worth noting that this isn't just poetic speculation. Psychologists studying temporal self-comparison have found that when people vividly imagine their past selves, they often experience shifts in behavior. They might feel more motivated to live up to their younger ideals, or more compassionate toward themselves. The imagined dialogue has real consequences. Our brains, after all, don't always distinguish between real interactions and vividly imagined ones. When you rehearse a conversation in your mind, many of the same neural circuits fire as if you were actually speaking. Meeting your past self in thought may carry emotional and even behavioral weight. But let's push further. If memory is a bridge, then it's not just one way. You're not only crossing to see your past self, they're also crossing to see you. Imagine your younger self watching you live, the way you sometimes watch characters in a film. They'd see your choices, your habits, your environment. What would they admire? What would they question? Sometimes the greatest growth comes not from telling your past self who you've become, but from realizing they are already watching. The mirror is double-sided. There's also a cultural dimension here. Different cultures value the past and the self in different ways. In some traditions, ancestors are honored, and identity is seen as deeply rooted in lineage. Meeting your past self in such a context wouldn't be just about you. It would be about carrying forward the hopes of your family, your community. In other cultures, the focus is on reinvention, on breaking free from the past to create something new. In that context, meeting your past self might feel like a confrontation with expectations you've outgrown. How you respond depends on the cultural lens through which you view time and identity. And yet beneath these cultural differences, there's something universal, the longing to feel whole. Human beings are storytellers, and our stories are not just about the present, but about the entire arc of our lives. We want to believe that the pieces fit together somehow, that the person we were, the person we are, and the person we're becoming are chapters of the same book. Meeting your past self dramatizes this longing. It gives form to the question, is my life a coherent story, or just a collection of disconnected moments? The answer might be both. Life often feels fragmented, but when you look back, patterns emerge. The dreams of your younger self, even if unfulfilled, may echo in what you do now. The mistakes you made may have planted seeds of wisdom. The joys you experienced may still fuel your laughter. Meeting your past self isn't about erasing differences, but recognizing connections. The dialogue across time is less about agreement and more about integration, finding a way to let every version of you have a seat at the table. To make this more vivid, picture a long dining table. At one end sits your childhood self, at the other end, your present self, and in between, every version of you that has ever existed. The table is alive with voices, curious, critical, hopeful, weary. Each one has something to say, a perspective to offer. The role of your current self is not to silence them, but to listen, to honor their part in the story. This image shows us that identity is not singular but plural, not fixed but unfolding. You are not one voice but a chorus. Meeting your past self is simply hearing the chorus more clearly. If memory is a bridge, then every time you cross it, you're already encountering a version of your past self. You may not see them sitting across from you in flesh and bone, but the very act of remembering is an encounter. It's not just data being retrieved from storage, like opening an old file on a computer. It's more like reliving, re-experiencing, and reinterpreting. In those moments, your past self lives again, not exactly as they were, but as your present mind reshapes them. This is what makes memory so mysterious. We often imagine it as a perfect archive, a collection of snapshots stored in the brain. But research shows it's far less stable. Every time you recall something, you don't simply replay it, you reconstruct it. Neurons fire, details are filled in, emotions are reattached, and sometimes elements are subtly altered. Then, when you save that memory again, the altered version becomes the one you'll remember in the future. In this sense, memory is alive, constantly changing, shaped as much by who you are now as by who you were then. So what does this mean for meeting your past self? It means that you've already been doing it in fragments for your entire life. When you recall your first day of school, or the moment you first fell in love, or the sting of a loss, you're not just looking at a mental picture, you're sitting with the person you were in that moment. You hear their voice, feel their emotions, see the world as they saw it. They are summoned into the present, and for a few seconds you coexist. But here's where the paradox deepens. If your memories are constantly reshaped, then the past self you're meeting in memory is not identical to the one who actually lived that moment. They're a blend, part genuine echo, part present-day reconstruction. Which raises a question: are you truly meeting your past self, or are you meeting your current self's version of who that person was? And if that's the case, does it even matter? After all, the you of today is the one doing the remembering, and perhaps that's the only meeting that can ever occur. Consider how powerful this can be. If every act of remembering is also an act of reshaping, then your relationship with your past self is not fixed. You can heal it, soften it, reinterpret it. You can go back to moments of shame and see them with compassion. You can revisit times of joy and let them nourish you again. Memory becomes a tool for time travel, not in the sense of physically returning to the past, but in the sense of emotionally and psychologically re-experiencing it. Each time you remember, you invite your past self into the present. This is why therapists sometimes use memory exercises to help people heal. By guiding someone to revisit a painful memory with the perspective of their present self, they help that person integrate the experience rather than remain trapped by it. In that moment, it's almost as though the present self steps back into the past, offering comfort, guidance, or understanding to the younger self who endured it. It's not science fiction, it's psychology, and yet the experience can feel uncanny, as if two versions of the same person really are meeting across time. Now imagine extending this idea. What if, instead of waiting for memories to arise naturally, you could intentionally summon your past self for a dialogue? You sit quietly, close your eyes, and choose an age. 10 years old, 15, 25. You picture where you were then, what you cared about, what weighed on your heart, and then you allow yourself to speak with them. You listen to what they say. In doing so, you give them a voice in your present life. This isn't fantasy, it's a form of visualization, and countless people have found it meaningful. It's one way of consciously crossing the bridge of memory. But memory is not just about personal identity, it's also about culture and collective history. When a society remembers, it too reconstructs the past. revisiting it through rituals, stories, monuments, and commemorations. In that sense, cultures meet their past selves collectively. Sometimes this is done with pride, as when a nation recalls moments of triumph. Sometimes it's done with regret, as when societies confront injustices. Just as individuals reshape their past through memory, communities do the same. Which means that the question of meeting your past self isn't just personal, it's universal. There's also an intriguing scientific dimension here. Neuroscientists talk about mental time travel, our brain's ability to project ourselves backward into memory and forward into imagination. The same neural networks light up when we recall the past and when we envision the future. This suggests that the act of meeting your past self and the act of meeting your future self are not so different. Both rely on the mind's capacity to step outside the immediate present, to inhabit another point in time. When you remember, you're not just looking back, you're practicing the same skill you use when you dream about what lies ahead. This brings us to a subtle but profound insight. Maybe the past self you meet is not fixed, because who you were back then isn't fixed either. At the time, you were full of potential, open to multiple paths, and the memory you now hold is just one crystallized version of that possibility. When you revisit it, you stir up not only what was, but what could have been. It's why nostalgia can feel bittersweet, not only because you miss what you had, but because you glimpse the versions of yourself that never came to be. So when you meet your past self in memory, you're not just meeting the person you were, you're meeting the branching possibilities of your own life, the alternate routes that were once open but are now closed. It's like standing at a crossroads again, seeing the paths you didn't take. That can bring grief, but it can also bring clarity. It reminds you that life was never about a single perfect route, but about choosing, moving, becoming. And it suggests that your current self too stands at a crossroads, still open to multiple futures. Another layer of paradox lies in the fact that memory doesn't always belong solely to us. Families share memories. Friends hold pieces of our past that we ourselves have forgotten. Meeting your past self might mean listening to someone else recall who you were, seeing yourself through their eyes. Sometimes these accounts surprise us. A sibling remembers our childhood differently. A friend recalls a moment we barely registered. A parent describes a younger version of us we no longer recognize. In those moments, we're confronted with a past self we didn't even know existed. The bridge of memory is wider than we thought. And yet, despite all these layers of complexity, the act of remembering always brings us back to the same simple truth. Our past selves are not gone. They live within us, not as frozen figures, but as fluid presences. Each memory we recall is a kind of meeting, and each meeting reshapes the way we walk forward. Perhaps the real gift of imagining a reunion with your past self is realizing that the reunion is already happening. All the time, in every recollection, in every story you tell about your life. Think about how often you catch yourself saying, "I used to be," or "when I was younger." These phrases are not just casual storytelling. They're acknowledgements of continuity. They reveal that you carry multiple versions of yourself inside you at once. You are both the narrator and the character, both the present and the past. The bridge is never closed. In that sense, meeting your past self is not a rare or impossible event. It's woven into daily life. Every photo you look at, every song that reminds you of a time, every place you revisit, these are encounters. Some feel light-hearted, others profound, but all of them are threads tying you to who you've been. And each thread strengthens the fabric of your identity, reminding you that while you've changed, you've also endured. The paradox then is that meeting your past self is both impossible and inevitable. You cannot stand in the same room as the 10-year-old version of you in any literal sense, but you also cannot escape them because they're etched into your mind, ready to reappear the moment you remember. And when they do, the encounter is just as real, just as meaningful as any conversation with someone sitting across from you. Up to now, we've been thinking of meeting your past self as something that happens through memory, through reflection, through the reconstruction of moments long gone. But let's imagine something stranger, something more daring. What if your past self could actually respond? Not just as a static image in your mind, not just as a recollection you interpret, but as a living, breathing presence speaking back to you. What would they say? What questions would they ask? What would it feel like to have a two-way conversation across the expanse of time? This is where the thought experiment shifts from observation to interaction. If memory is a bridge, then until now we've been standing on one side, gazing across at the figure of our younger self. But what if they step forward too, crossing toward us, their footsteps echoing on the planks of the bridge, their eyes meeting ours with recognition? Suddenly, you're not just remembering them, you're encountering them as if they were here now. The first thing to imagine is their reaction. Would they recognize you? At first glance, probably not. You might look like a stranger. After all, you don't look the same as you once did. Age changes faces, time etches lines, experience alters posture and expression. But then, perhaps in your voice or in your eyes, they would see it, the trace of themselves, a flicker of familiarity, like looking at a family member who resembles you. That moment of recognition would be profound. They are you, and you are them. And the realization dawns on both sides simultaneously. Now comes the harder part. What would they ask? A younger self might not ask about philosophy or destiny. They might ask about simple things. Did we ever find love? Did we ever accomplish the dream we had when we were little? Are we happy? These are the questions that matter most to them, and they would not hesitate to ask them. You might feel unprepared to answer, because how do you sum up a life to someone who is just beginning it? How do you explain the trade-offs, the surprises, the unexpected turns? You might feel torn between honesty and protection. Do you tell them about the struggles, the heartbreaks, the failures? Or do you shield them, letting them hold on to their innocence for a little longer? But here's the paradox. They are already you, which means they're destined to live through it all anyway. The conversation becomes less about protecting them and more about witnessing them, honoring the person you were, with their wide eyes and uncertain steps. Imagine the dialogue. They might say, "Why did you give up on that dream?" "We wanted it so badly," you might answer, "I didn't give it up, I transformed it. It became something else, something I couldn't have seen from where you are." Or perhaps they say, "Why did you let that person hurt us?" And you respond, "Because at the time, we didn't know what we deserved, but we learned, and because of that, we're stronger now." These conversations would not be easy, but they would be raw, honest, and illuminating. And what about the questions you would ask them? You might ask, "What do you dream of right now? What matters most to you at this age?" In their answers, you would hear not only nostalgia, but also clarity. Sometimes our younger selves hold truths we've forgotten. They may remind you of passions you've set aside, of values you once held sacred but compromised over time. In that sense, they wouldn't just be a student in this conversation, they'd be a teacher too. This possibility that your past self could respond forces us to reimagine identity not as a single thread, but as an ongoing dialogue. It suggests that who you are is not only shaped by the past, but that the past continues to shape you through the conversations you imagine having with it. Every time you revisit your memories, you're not just looking back, you're reinterpreting, reframing, and in some sense, collaborating with your younger self. Now let's expand this thought experiment further. Suppose you could meet not just one past self, but several. A younger child version of you, an adolescent version, a young adult. Each one would have different questions, different emotions, different reactions. The child might look at you with wonder. The teenager might look at you with skepticism, maybe even disappointment. The young adult might look at you with curiosity, trying to see how the choices they're about to make will ripple outward. You'd find yourself juggling multiple conversations at once, each one tugging at different parts of your identity. Would those selves get along with each other? Imagine a room where your 10-year-old self, your 20-year-old self, and your current self are all sitting together. There might be conflict. The child might feel ignored by the adult. The adult might feel embarrassed by the teenager. The teenager might roll their eyes at both. But in the midst of that chaos, there could also be harmony. Each version brings something vital to the table: innocence, ambition, resilience, wisdom. The full picture of who you are comes from integrating them all. And what if the conversation went the other way? What if your past self, now aware of who you've become, challenged you? They might ask, did you stay kind? Or did we keep our promises? Or did we ever learn to love ourselves? These are not easy questions to answer. They cut through the noise of daily life and force you to confront your deepest truths. Sometimes the hardest accountability comes not from others, but from the person you once were. There's a reason why this thought experiment feels so powerful. It taps into something our brains already do in subtle ways. When people face difficult decisions, they sometimes imagine what their younger self would think. Would the child version of me be proud of this choice? Would the teenager understand why I'm compromising? Psychologists call this a form of self-distancing, a mental technique that allows us to step outside the immediacy of our perspective. Imagining your past self's response is a way of accessing wisdom you didn't know you still carried. But there's also an emotional risk here. What if the conversation revealed disappointment? What if your past self looked at you and said, "This isn't who I thought we'd be"? That sting could be hard to bear, yet even that could be valuable. Disappointment is not the end of the story. It's a challenge, an invitation to realign, to remember what matters most and steer closer to it. In that way, even a difficult meeting with your past self could become a turning point. This imagined dialogue also has implications for how we think about the future. If your past self can respond to you now, then your future self might one day respond to you as well. Just as you imagine your younger self asking, "Are we happy?" your older self might one day ask, "Did we live fully, or did we love enough?" The bridge of memory extends in both directions, linking past, present, and future in an ongoing exchange. You are both the student and the teacher, both the questioner and the answerer, across the span of your own timeline. There's a poetic symmetry in this. The past self longs to know how things turn out, while the present self longs to know if they were ever on the right path, and the future self longs to know if it was all worthwhile. None of these selves exist in isolation. They are bound together, each one shaping and reshaping the others in thought, in memory, in imagination. Meeting your past self and hearing them respond makes that interconnection visible. Ultimately, imagining your past self as a living conversational partner is less about fantasy and more about uncovering truth. Because whether or not they could literally step into your room, their voice already echoes in your choices, your dreams, your regrets. You already hear them sometimes, whispering from the corners of memory. Giving them the dignity of a response simply brings that whisper into the open, allowing you to learn from it, heal with it, and grow because of it. So far, we've imagined the meeting with your past self as a kind of dialogue, a conversation stretched across time. But what if it went further? What if it wasn't just about talking, but about sharing experience, walking side by side with your past self, seeing the world through both sets of eyes at once. This idea opens the thought experiment into something even richer, because it's no longer just about words, but about the raw fabric of living. Picture it. You and your 10-year-old self step outside together. The air feels different to each of you. To the child, the world is enormous, overflowing with possibility and mystery. To you, the adult, the world is layered with responsibility, memory, and context. The same street, the same trees, the same sky, but two completely different experiences. You'd notice details they would overlook, and they'd notice wonders you've stopped paying attention to. They'd point out the pattern in the clouds, the way the sunlight hits the leaves, the small insect crawling across the pavement. You'd point out the way the seasons shift, the way history has reshaped the buildings, the way people carry invisible stories in their expressions. Together, the world would feel fuller, more dimensional. This is one of the gifts of imagining shared experience with your past self. It reminds you of the layers of perception you've lost and gained over time. Childhood often sees magic in the mundane. Adulthood often sees depth in the ordinary. When combined, the two perspectives create a kind of wholeness. You don't have to choose between wonder and wisdom. You can hold both. Now imagine doing something simple, like eating a meal together. Your past self might marvel at the taste, the colours, the joy of the moment. They might eat without guilt, without self-consciousness, savouring the pure pleasure of it. You, on the other hand, might think about nutrition, balance, or even carry habits of restraint or indulgence. Sitting together at the same table, you'd realise how much your relationship with even the simplest experiences has changed. And you might ask yourself, what have I gained and what have I lost? Or think about watching a sunset. Your past self would gasp at the colours, maybe run toward the horizon with arms outstretched. You might stand quietly, letting it stir something reflective, even bittersweet. Together, you'd experience both the exuberance of discovery and the gravity of time passing. It's as though you're viewing the same canvas with two sets of eyes, and in doing so, you discover how much richness is possible when you allow multiple versions of yourself to share the moment. The most powerful shared experiences, though, would be revisiting places of personal significance. Imagine taking your past self to a spot that was important to them. Maybe a childhood bedroom, a favourite park, a schoolyard. They would feel the flood of immediacy, the rawness of what those spaces once meant. For you, those places might now feel smaller, quieter, filled with echoes rather than presence. The contrast would be striking, and in that contrast you'd come to see how time reshapes not just places, but the meanings you attach to them. But what about the other way around? Imagine bringing your past self into your current life. Take them to your workplace, to your home, to the spaces you inhabit daily. To them, it would all seem extraordinary, foreign, futuristic, almost overwhelming. They'd look at your technology, your responsibilities, your routines with a mix of awe and confusion. Suddenly, the ordinary life you sometimes take for granted would be revealed through fresh eyes. You'd remember that nothing is truly ordinary. It only becomes so through repetition. Sharing experience with your past self also forces you to notice how your body, your mind, and your habits have changed. Walk together up a hill. Your younger self might sprint ahead, full of energy. You might pace yourself, thinking of joints and endurance. But when you reach the top together, the view would mean different things. To them, it's a conquest, a playful victory. To you, it's a reminder of resilience, of persistence through the years. Both are valid, both are beautiful. And then there are emotional experiences. What if your past self accompanied you through a moment of sorrow? They might not understand the depth of it, but they'd bring with them a raw honesty, an unfiltered reaction. Or what if they joined you in a celebration, a moment of joy? Their laughter might be freer, more uninhibited, and it could spark your own. These shared emotional experiences would highlight the evolution of your inner life, the way time both tempers and deepens feeling. This exercise isn't just imaginative play, it reflects a psychological truth. Our minds often carry inner child perspectives, echoes of earlier selves that surface in the present. When we feel playful, scared, or deeply moved, those younger voices sometimes stir within us. To consciously imagine sharing experiences with your past self is a way of acknowledging those voices, giving them space, and allowing them to enrich your present rather than haunt it. Consider how different your decisions might feel if your past self were there to witness them. Would you still rush through your day, glued to routines, if you knew your childhood self was tagging along, marveling at the world? Would you still dismiss your creative impulses if your teenage self was beside you, urging you to take risks? Would you still silence your emotions if your younger self was watching, hoping you'd model courage? Sometimes the act of imagining shared experience isn't just reflective, it's transformative. It reshapes how you act in the present. There's also the possibility of healing through these shared moments. If your past self lived through hardship, you could show them how life unfolds afterward, that joy and peace are still possible. If they carried fears, you could walk them through the evidence that you've survived, that they were braver than they realized. Conversely, they might remind you of resilience you've forgotten, of laughter that once came easily, of dreams you once believed in. Walking side by side with your past self is not just nostalgic, it's reparative, it's integrative, it's a way of making peace. Let's push this even further. Imagine not just walking beside your past self, but actually sharing perspective, seeing the world literally through their eyes while they see it through yours. What would it feel like to look at your present life with the innocence of a child? What would it feel like for your younger self to glimpse the layers of complexity you now perceive? That blending of perspectives could expand empathy, not just for yourself across time, but for others in the present. After all, every person you meet carries their own past selves within them. By practicing empathy toward your own, you sharpen empathy for theirs. The thought experiment of shared experience also carries a strange implication. Perhaps, in a way, it's already happening. After all, every time you recall a childhood joy, a teenage dream, or an early heartbreak, you're reliving the experience alongside the self who lived it first. You're not just a spectator, you're a participant, drawn back into the scene with all its sensations. Maybe the act of remembering isn't just replaying, but actually rejoining. Maybe memory itself is the mechanism by which shared experience across time becomes possible. If that's true, then the bridge of memory is not a one-way crossing, but a place where two selves walk together. You are never entirely alone in your experiences, because your past selves are always with you, watching, reminding, participating in subtle ways. Sometimes they burden you, sometimes they inspire you, but they are always present. And by imagining walking consciously beside them, you bring that truth into awareness. There's still a deeper layer to explore, one that sits at the heart of philosophy and psychology. If you stood face to face with your past self, would you even recognize them as you? And if you did, what would that recognition reveal about the nature of identity? At first, it seems obvious that, of course, your past self is still you. They carry your DNA, your history, your earliest memories. But pause for a moment. Think of how much you've changed over the years, not just in appearance, but in perspective, values, and understanding. The person you were 5 years ago might not agree with the choices you make now. The person you were 10 years ago might not understand them. and the child you once were might not even believe they're possible. This raises a haunting question. Are your past selves truly the same person as you, or are they strangers you've left behind? Philosophers have wrestled with this question for centuries. John Locke, for instance, proposed that identity is tied to memory. If you can remember an experience, then you are the same person who lived it. Memory, in this sense, is the thread stitching together all the different stages of your life. Without it, identity fragments. That's why amnesia is so unsettling. It severs the continuity we rely on to feel like a single, unified self. But memory is far from reliable. Studies in neuroscience have shown that every time you recall an event, your brain doesn't simply replay it like a recording. It reconstructs it, often reshaping details, sometimes even inventing them. Over time, the memory you carry may drift away from what actually happened. So if memory is the bridge between past and present selves, it's not a sturdy stone bridge. It's more like a rope bridge, swaying, frayed, patched together by imagination as much as fact. Can something so unstable really hold the weight of identity? Let's extend the thought experiment. Imagine your past self standing before you and you realize they don't remember what you remember. They haven't lived through what you've lived through. The bridge of memory only goes one way. You remember them, but they don't know you yet. This creates an asymmetry. You are them, but they are not you. And in that gap lies the mystery of identity. Consider it like a flame. A flame burning today isn't composed of the same particles of fire that burned yesterday, yet we call it the same flame because the pattern continues. Likewise, the you of today isn't made of the same cells or the same exact thoughts as your past self. But the pattern of continuity, memory, personality, narrative, creates the illusion of sameness. Meeting your past self would force you to confront that illusion. You'd realize that while you share a name, a body, and a thread of story, you might in fact be meeting a different person entirely. This becomes even more intriguing when you ask, what happens if you disagree with your past self? Say you meet your teenage self and they're stubbornly clinging to an idea you now reject. Who is right? Are they less authentically you because you've outgrown that belief? Or are they a version of you that deserves equal validity? If every past self had their own seat at the table, you'd find yourself surrounded by a crowd of selves. Child, teenager, young adult, middle-aged, elderly. All with different priorities, fears and dreams. Which one is the true you? Or is you simply the sum of all of them? A chorus rather than a single voice. This isn't just an abstract puzzle. It has deep implications for how we think about growth and regret. If your past self is truly you, then you carry responsibility for their choices, even the ones you now regret. But if they are in some sense a different person, then perhaps forgiveness is easier. You can look at them with compassion, the way you would a friend or even a child, and say, that was them, doing their best with what they knew. That perspective can transform guilt into understanding, shame into empathy, and yet there's still a sense of continuity that refuses to dissolve. After all, your past selves live within you, not just in memory, but in habits, reflexes, the very wiring of your brain. A song you loved as a child still stirs something in you today. A scar on your skin tells a story your younger self lived. A fear or joy seeded long ago still blooms in your reactions. So perhaps identity isn't about sameness, but about layering. Each past self is still here, nested inside the present, like rings within a tree trunk. You're not a single self stretched thin across time, but an accumulation of selves, one wrapped around the other. This layered identity becomes even more poignant when you imagine what your past self would see in you. To them, you might seem like a stranger. Your voice is deeper, your face older, your mannerisms refined or restrained. You know things they don't, you carry burdens they can't imagine. And yet in small gestures, the way you smile, the way your eyes light up, the way you tilt your head when curious, they would recognize themselves. That flicker of recognition would be the reminder that despite all the change, something essential persists. Maybe it's not the details that matter, but the essence, the unique rhythm of consciousness that carries forward. Identity, then, may not be about being the same across time, but about being connected across time. Your past self, your present self, and your future self form a chain, each link distinct but inseparable from the others. Break one, and the chain loses meaning. Keep them connected, and you realize you are not one person, but many, and yet you are also one. It's a paradox, but perhaps a necessary one. Now think about what this reunion reveals about your future self. If you can look at your past self and see both difference and connection, then surely your future self one day look back at you the same way. They will see your choices, your flaws, your triumphs, and perhaps shake their head in disbelief. But they will also feel gratitude, for without you, they could not exist. This thought experiment is not only about bridging backward, it's about imagining the bridge ahead. Meeting your past self makes you aware that you will, one day, be someone else's past self. And just as you hope your younger version would be kind to you, you can decide to be kind to the versions of yourself still to come. So what does all this tell us? That identity is not fixed, not singular, not simple. It's a living, breathing process, shaped by time and memory, fractured yet continuous. Meeting your past self would reveal both the strangeness and the beauty of that truth. You would see that you are not the same person you once were, and yet you are inseparably bound to them. You would see that regret is softened by compassion, and that growth is not betrayal but transformation. And most importantly, you would realize that identity is not about being constant, it's about being connected. In the end, the thought experiment doesn't just raise questions about who you were, it asks you to reflect on who you are now and who you are becoming. It asks whether you are willing to see yourself not as a single story, but as a library of selves, each chapter shaping the next. Meeting your past self would not just be a reunion, it would be a revelation, a mirror showing you that you are both more fractured and more whole than you ever imagined. We've travelled far in this thought experiment, from the first moment of imagining a face-to-face encounter with your past self, to exploring dialogue, shared experiences, memory as a bridge, and the very question of identity itself. But now it's time to step back and look at what such a reunion would ultimately reveal. Not just about who you were, but about who you are and who you might become. If you stood across from your past self, one of the first realizations would be that they are still alive within you. Their joys, their fears, their unfulfilled dreams and unanswered questions, they didn't vanish when time moved forward. They simply changed form, folded into the person you are today. Every memory you carry is proof of that continuity. Even when memory shifts or fades, its emotional imprint remains, shaping your choices in ways you might not even notice. Meeting your past self would make that truth unmistakable. You are not only the sum of your past, but also the caretaker of it. But there's another side to this reunion. By standing with your past self, you also glimpse the possibility of standing with your future self. Just as you might look at your younger version with compassion, wisdom, and sometimes frustration, so too will your future self look at you. They will carry your scars and triumphs, your lessons and mistakes, and they will rely on you to be kind to them, to set the stage for their life to unfold with strength and clarity. This thought experiment, then, isn't only about looking backward, it's about looking both directions at once, realizing you're always in the middle of a bridge between past and future. The reunion also reveals something profound about regret. Often we look back on past versions of ourselves with shame or disappointment, wishing we'd acted differently, chosen differently, spoken differently. But if you truly stood across from your past self, would you condemn them? Or would you see a person doing their best with what they knew at the time? Likely, you'd feel compassion. You'd want to reassure them, not punish them. And that raises the question, why not extend that same compassion to yourself now? You deserve the same gentleness you'd give to your younger self. This shift in perspective is one of the most powerful gifts of the thought experiment. And what about the lighter side? Meeting your past self wouldn't be only serious and reflective, it would also carry joy, humour, even wonder. Imagine laughing together about old habits, comparing notes on your quirks, delighting in how far you've come. There's something deeply freeing about recognizing that you can look back with love, even when the past was messy or difficult. That laughter is part of the healing too. In some ways, the thought experiment is a mirror for how we already live. Memory itself is a reunion, one that happens every time you close your eyes and recall a moment from years ago. Every time you tell a story from your past, you bring your younger self into the present, letting them speak again through your words. The past self is never gone. They're a travelling companion, silent most of the time, but always present, waiting for you to notice them. And here's where sleep becomes part of the story again. Sleep is the natural bridge between states of being, between day and night, between consciousness and the hidden depths of the mind. It's also the place where memory is processed, consolidated, and reshaped. Dreams often bring fragments of your past into the present, sometimes in strange and surreal ways. In that sense, every night you already meet your past selves, in images and sensations that rise unbidden. Sleep is one of the places where time bends, where yesterday and today mingle, where the bridge of memory is walked without effort. To wonder if you could meet your past self is, in some sense, to recognize that you already do, quietly, each time you drift into dreams. So what would a reunion reveal? It would show you that time doesn't erase, it transforms. It would show you that identity isn't fixed. It flows, layered and shifting, yet connected by threads of memory and meaning. It would show you that compassion for your past self leads to compassion for your present and future selves too. And perhaps most importantly, it would remind you that you are never alone. The person you once were, the person you are now, and the person you are becoming, they walk with you, always. As we close this journey, let yourself imagine one last scene. Picture your past self beside you, maybe holding your hand, maybe just smiling in recognition. Picture your future self watching quietly, not yet fully visible, but already shaped by the steps you're taking now. And then picture yourself, here in this moment, the link between them. Past, present, future, all meeting in you. It's not just a thought experiment. It's the reality of being human, of carrying time within you. So tonight, as you drift into sleep, carry that image with you. Think of memory not as a distant echo, but as a bridge you can walk across whenever you choose. Think of your past self not as a stranger, but as a companion who still lives within you. And think of your future self as someone waiting to thank you for the care you give to this moment. Let those thoughts settle gently as you rest, a reminder that time is not a wall dividing you from who you were, but a bridge connecting every version of yourself into one continuous, mysterious whole. Good night, and may your journey across the bridges of memory bring you peace.